Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our annual Yom HaShoah commemoration. This is sponsored by the Sarasota Manatee Rabbinic Association, and I want to say that Rabbi Benjamin Shull from Venice and I have put this program together. I have been asked to request that those who are not participating or not participating at that moment stay muted. I also want to ask in advance forgiveness for all the technological glitches that may occur this evening. We are amateurs at this. Our new multi-million-dollar studio is not yet in place on Longboat Gate. This is a fundraising speech. I also want to go out of my way to welcome Pieter Kohnstam and his wife, Susan, for being here this evening and being our special speakers. We are going to begin with the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner and Hatikva, and Cantor Marcy Vitkus will lead us. Those who are able, please rise. If you're able.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hail at the twilight's last gleaming, whose proud stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Now you'll join me for Hatikva. Kol od baleva benima nefesh Yehudi homiya ulafate Mizrach kadima ayin letzion Sophia, Od lo tikvatenu, hatikva bat shnot alpayim, liotam chofshi be'artzenu, Eretz Zion, Yerushalayim, liotam chofshi be'artzenu, Eretz Zion, Yerushalayim.
Please be seated. A reading, a poem, an oath by Avraham Shlonsky, and Rabbi Jennifer Singer will lead us.
I have taken an oath to remember it all, to remember, to forget nothing at all, forgetting nothing of this till the 10th generation, till the grief disappears, to the last, to its ending, till the punishing blows are ended for good. I swear this night of terror shall not have passed in vain. I swear this morning I'll not live unchanged, as if I were no wiser even now even now.
Amen.
A song, Moshelach Shloimelech, cantor Rizal Bain. You need to unmute.
Okay. There we go. Okay. We must never forget the enormous number of Jewish children who were murdered by the Nazis during the Holocaust. Nor should we forget the horror their parents felt as they watched their children disappear before their eyes. Some died quickly, marching into gas chambers. For many others, death came more slowly through hunger, disease, and mistreatment. In the end, though, the result was the same. The voice of the millions of Jewish children was stilled forever. Yiddish poet Joseph Papiernikov captured the sadness of this tragedy in a poem called Under the Little Polish Green Trees, which was set to music by Israel Alter as Moshelach Shloimelech. It reads, under the young Polish green trees no longer play little Moses and little Solomon, no longer play little Sarah, little Leah. There is no more grass, just covered with snow. The voices are no longer heard from the little Yiddish yeshivas. From their mouths came pearls of wisdom, little Muttel, little Simon, their faces showing off their strength of wisdom. And now among the Polish forest, the Jewish homes are destroyed. The alleys and the byways have been cut down. Now the Jewish children are hiding like mice. Jewish children with their great big black eyes, now with dark circles under their eyes, which are filled with fear from the unfortunate luck which has been brought down upon them. I'm going to add one melodic line from another famous piece that I'm sure you will all recognize, and I do have to thank my wonderful, talented neighbor, Lee Dorothy Ross, for joining me tonight. We've been Pripyat, rent a fire, or inch stub is this. Und der Rebbe lernt kleine Kinderlach, dem Aleph ist. Unter die polische grünen Gebäumelach spielen sich mehr mit kein Moshelach Shloimelech. Spielen
A reading from the 37th chapter of Ezekiel, Rabbi Michael Sheffrin.
The hand of the Eternal was upon me, setting me down in the midst of a valley. It was full of bones, and they were very dry. God said to me, "Can these bones live?" I answered, "Eternal God, you alone know." Then God said to me, "Prophesy to these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Eternal One. Behold, I will cause breath to enter you, that you may live. I will lay sinews upon you, and cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, that you may live. Then you shall know that I am the Eternal." So I prophesied as God commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived. They stood on their feet, a very great host. Then God said to me, "These bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, and we are cut off. Therefore prophesy to them and say, Thus says the Eternal God, behold, I will open your graves, O my people, and I will bring you home to the land of Israel. I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live. I will place you in your own land. Then you shall know that I, the Eternal, have spoken and acted."
At this point, I'm going to call on Rabbi Benjamin Shull, who will introduce and interview our speaker, Pieter Kohnstam.
Thank you, Rabbi Sniderman. It truly is my pleasure to introduce, and my honor to introduce, our featured speaker, Pieter Kohnstam. I've had the pleasure of serving as Peter's congregational rabbi. I wouldn't say his rabbi, because knowing Peter, he has a number of rabbis, but I'm honored to be among the list. There's one word, I think, which describes Peter, if you've had any dealings with him, that is irrepressible. He has an irrepressible spirit, always extending his hand to people, the first to greet people. He is a raconteur. He loves spinning yarns and telling wonderful stories, and he has a very powerful story to tell tonight. More officially, Peter is on the board of the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect, which is an international organization. And also, we're very proud that both Susan, his wife, and Peter received the Legacy of Hope Award for their humanitarian work from the Anne Frank Center. Also, Peter is a former president of the Jewish Congregation of Venice and author of his memoir, A Chance to Live, A Family's Journey to Freedom. And I would say, finally, Peter, you are an all-round good deed doer, which is, I think, the greatest of compliments, I hope. So, Peter, I know you and Susan are going to power up that PowerPoint so we can take you through this story.
Well, I want to thank you, Rabbi Shull, for your words. And just so that it's official, you are our rabbi, you are my rabbi,
Okay.
okay?
Thank you.
There are other clergy here that I wanted to say hello. Rabbi Sniderman, Rabbi Ari, and others. And I am honored and pleased to do this on this remembrance for what is being celebrated today and possibly this week. So I'll do my best to accommodate.
Thank you, Peter. So I believe everyone can see the PowerPoint presentation, and that's Peter's book, A Chance to Live, A Family's Journey to Freedom. Peter, as you can see, eventually made it to Argentina. I don't think we'll take it that far in the story. We're going to be focusing on Peter's early years. And Susan, if you could continue with the next slide.
I could.
See if it works.
Yeah, here we go.
All right, Peter, if you could tell us a little bit about your family's background. I know your family originates in Germany and then eventually found your way to Holland.
Yes. Actually, yes, the family ancestry goes back in Germany to 1651. And just because I generally digress a little bit, Susan's going to kick me in a minute. I was just reading yesterday that HaKohem, which is our original name, there was a family in France in the 1600s, and they already existed. The synagogue that you see is what it says. It's the Nuremberg Big Synagogue. My parents got married there in 1932. Next to it is the inside, the wedding party. And the next one is my parents walking out after the reception. Then naturally Kristallnacht happened in 1938. That's 5 years later. And recently what is left of these destroyed synagogues, which as you can see were massive buildings, is a memorial in Nuremberg with that stone and the names of the people who were on the board and the people who were running. Possibly the rabbi's name is there too on that stone. Next to it is a garage station, by the way. Next. In the 1930s in Nuremberg, you see on the top left, some of you all have traveled. It's still very much like that, even though Nuremberg was greatly destroyed during the Second World War. But that is what it looked like, and in many cases, still today. My father was an artist. He had studied at a Bauhaus in Dessau and with Gropius. There were many other upcoming and already known artists there. And he had painted a Saint Sebastian that was seen from the street. As you can see, there's some buildings there with the windows on the street. And it was always popular and still is to have the curtains ajar so that people could look into the apartments. There was a Saint Sebastian. Somebody walked by, and the next thing, my grandfather, who was my father's father, got a call from the chief of police of Nuremberg, who he knew that my father his artwork had been accused of degenerate art, and that he suggested he leave within half an hour. And after a very emotional discussion, father and son, he did leave, leaving everything behind, naturally, and not knowing when he was going to get back, and went to Amsterdam because his father had indicated he could. Amsterdam, the Netherlands was neutral. The company had an office and warehouse. He could work there and make some living, and maybe way out if the clouds of war were going to pass or not. Ensuingly, we just found this picture on the top right of Dreyfus. It's pretty clear what you can see. On the bottom left are one of the many, about a dozen or more rallies in Nuremberg. And there was one of them, I don't know if this is it, where they had 700,000 people gathered there. The next one is just to indicate, especially to the young people, the German standards and what they used to march in. Now I cannot play you the marches because that was very meaningful in infusing fear into the people. And you can see the swastika banners with the top circles with the eagles. And if anybody is thinking of the Roman legions, you're absolutely correct, because that is what Hitler had in mind. Next. This is the street, Merwede Plain, where many immigrants came to live. We were not immigrants. Many came to stay in Amsterdam or the Netherlands, neutral country, and you could work. And in this neighborhood specifically, there were many people who were weighing and waiting to see what would happen. And eventually my parents moved into number 17 on the ground floor, and 2 apartments away on the second floor or third floor was lived the Franks. And my parents became very, very good friends. Ensuingly, my mother and Anna hit it off. She became my babysitter and her playmate. She was in our apartment almost daily, picked me up from school. Also because my grandmother was an excellent baker, and she loved to eat the cakes. And my grandmother was also playing. I was sort of I was audience. So she was writing, acting, pranking, etc. Next. Oh, if you want, I'll tell the story about the blue, what's it called?
Scooter.
The scooter. Since my family, my parents, well, my father and the family were in the toy merchandising business, and they were very well known all through Europe and other countries in Europe. One day I got a scooter, and this was still during the good times before the occupation in 1940. And I was popular with some of the kids during the good times because we had the toys. And I saw the scooter, which is not this scooter, but this sort of clicked the memory that I have. And immediately had to try it out across the street. The park is still in existence. And a bad maneuver, we fell. I opened my chin. This is now 1938, 39. You couldn't go to hospital or nothing because we were already separated in society as Jews. But somebody in the neighborhood showed me up, and I have a little souvenir of Anne Frank on my chin. Next. Susan.
Yeah, this is a very interesting story. In the year 2008, we made one of our trips to Amsterdam, and friends of ours had alerted their friends in Amsterdam, who then alerted the press and the TV, and met us in front of number 17 Merwede Plain at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning to interview Peter. So we were standing out there and they interviewed him, and then somebody said, we ought to knock on the door of number 17, let's see what happens. So they knocked on the door, and the lady on the left here answered the door. Her name is Rianne Verhoeven, and the apartments that Peter's family originally lived in are now condos. Rianne happened to be the head historian at the Anne Frank Museum. She knew the Kohnstams had lived in the apartment, but never wanted to find out if they were where they were, because she was afraid she was owning an apartment where people were murdered. So she was thrilled to see us all there, invited us into the apartment where everybody looked around, and she has written one of the books on Anne Frank, and has also gone on to write a book about Merwede Plain, unfortunately, it's in Dutch, so we haven't been able to read it. So and then the next day we went to the Anne Frank Museum and she introduced us to everybody. And that's how we got a lot of information and a lot of connections, because she could verify the fact that Peter had lived in that apartment. She had his father's rental agreement even.
And on that Sunday, that was the first time in about, I would say, 60 years that I visited the apartment, and I walked in. I said hello to Rianne. I don't know how to speak French, but she knew English. And I walked through the apartment. It was exactly as I remembered it, except in one room. And she explained what she had done since. This picture is interesting because it shows a few things. First, yes, you guessed, the families. On top is Otto Frank, Anna in the front, Margot in the back, and Edith on the far right, my father on the bottom middle, and then my family. What is interesting is how people dressed in those days at any time. And you will see one or two slides later, people fleeing, and they were still dressed like going to work. Naturally, hats and 2 or 3 piece suits, etc. That was the rigueur. Next. This is Anne on the left, looking down on the back of her apartment to our garden, which you see on the right. And my mother told a story, we couldn't find it, that she hid some stuff before fleeing in that garden. And the bottom one is an alley that my father used to flee when we were ordered to go to Westerbork, to the station, to be transported to Westerbork, and from there to concentration camp. Now we come to a different period. One has to understand that since 1933, when Hitler became in charge of Germany and so on, matters politically started to gradually get nasty and difficult for the Jews, for the Romanis, for homosexuals and others. And here we are talking 1940-41, the occupation of Amsterdam happened in 1940. And what you see on the top left reminds me of the raids that the Nazis conducted on the hour every day for a long time in front and in plain view of us. So what happened here when the raids were handled, or conducted rather, they had a little convoy of 3 mechanized pieces of equipment, a truck preceded by a sidecar motorcycle with a sergeant or somebody, the truck, and then on the back is in this case, a convertible car, a German car, naturally, with the captain or somebody who gave the orders. So unannounced, and well, they would naturally, they were scared stiff. You have to think that this is already 1940, and we were already wearing the Stars of David, forced by the occupation forces. And they would come and raid and break and kill and take everything away that they could. In my case, we just stood there in the apartment, and my grandmother did the talking a little bit. They didn't destroy or take anything, but suddenly I felt that my mother, I was standing in the front of my parents, next to me was my grandmother in the front of them. And I felt a little something, a paper was being slipped into my hand. And you have to understand that there was no training for this. We didn't know how we were going to react. I was a little kid in those days, but it didn't matter if you were a little kid or a teenager. I saw teenagers being machine gunned down the street daily for not betraying others. And so at some point, without moving, made believe I was coughing. Then I made believe I blew my nose, put it in my mouth and swallowed it,
The paper, yeah.
and the Germans left. And so I swallowed this paper. And then I asked my grandmother, I said, you know, I swallowed this paper. What happens next? She said, don't worry, it'll come out. What this paper mentioned were 3 or 4 families. Now you'll see the picture of one of the people who helped us during that time, and that is who we went as soon as we had to be going to the railroad station. Now you see the Stars of David, you all know that. I'm not going to waste time. I do have a Star of David in my possession, which I wore. What that's interesting in each, Susan made a quilt so many years ago, which we show in our presentations to students, and it mentions the word Jew, just like that, Jew, in the language of the country. To me, that connotation and word Jew, which is naturally much used by a lot of people these days, to me, it's a connotation of an insult or of an offense. Now, the Stars of David was a new thing in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Austria, Czechoslovakia. Well, let's talk about the Netherlands and Germany. What it did, it separated one important group of society from another one that had been active in aiding, financing, etc., in Germany for hundreds of years. In a country that was friendly, generally Dutch people were always very friendly in public transportation on the streets. Now suddenly people didn't look at each other anymore. They spat on you occasionally. There were people, I saw soldiers taking, in one case, an elderly man to shine the boots of a soldier. He wasn't even an officer. And when he finished, the soldier spat on it and grabbed the man by his head. The hat flew away in the wind and had to polish with his hands. And Susan continues.
Yeah, the picture on the right was something given to us by Rianne that she found taken about that time on Merveda Plain. It looks exactly like his mother with the Star of David on, but we have no verification that that's what it is. And on the bottom here is a school that was set aside for Jewish children. Peter said he recognized the teacher and the principal in the school. We think that this is Peter over on the side, but we're not sure about it. But it's pretty sure that Peter did attend this school for a little while before they left.
Okay. When I told you I had that little paper that I swallowed, one of the names of the people is that Gerda Leske, who made arrangements for us. You will see it shortly on a map. There is the railroad station today, or modern times, well, modern times, last 10 years. That is not the way that railroad station in Amsterdam looked at during June of 1942, I can assure you. The transportation is still white and blue, I remember that. What you see next on the bottom left and on the right is, on the bottom left, the instructions sent to us, ordered by the Nazi occupation forces through the Center for Jewish Immigration in Amsterdam. And this is what they allowed us to take to the station, to be transported to Westerbork, which was a gathering prison station, from where then every week there would be transports of 650 people, thereabouts, 3-day to 4-day trips to Theresienstadt, where we were supposed to be taken to, or Auschwitz. Naturally, all those products that you see were taken away once you got to Westerbork and then to be transported. Next.
Yeah, well, let me just add.
Oh, yeah,
Well, Peter's family, as well as the Franks, got this call-up notice, and Peter's family decided they were not going to. They were invited to go to into hiding with the Franks, but decided that that would not work for them. First of all, Peter's parents' marriage seemed to be over, and they had this active 6-year-old whom would be intolerable to be in a closed space with. So they decided that they had to flee. That was their only chance.
And by the way, that lady, they were Christian Germans, very friendly to us. They risked their lives. And 5 years ago, we were able to.
They were, they're at Yad Vashem as righteous Gentiles, yeah, for saving their lives.
At some point, Edith Frank told my mother that she was complaining, Edith, to my mother, that Anna was leaving all her papers that she was writing, etc., thrown around their apartment. And well, she didn't do well with that. She was naturally maybe more proper than others, and everything had to be in place, etc., etc., etc. So my mother suggested, why don't you buy a diary? It was going to be Anna Frank's 13th birthday, June of 1942 or 43. Yeah. And so it was. Now, Anne was 7 years older than I was, and going into puberty, and very interested, sprightly and pranky, and interested in cosmetics. She would make believe in acting, and high heels, red high heels, and movie stars and actors and movies. And there you see it on the wall with a few pictures. If you do the virtual tour through the annex, or you have gone, you will see in a bedroom many more photographs on a wall. Interestingly enough, Annie liked red, and somehow the mother bought the red diary, and one can make the assumption that maybe that was one way of getting a red diary. On the bottom is naturally what you see, her handwriting and some photographs of the time of a younger Anne. Next. Okay. Here there are various things. On the top, on the left side, you have 3 maps. The top is the Netherlands, naturally, showing how our flight escape went from Amsterdam all the way to Barcelona in Spain. Through Gerda Leske, she came up with a plan. I'm not going to waste your time tonight too much, because each stop or period is a long story. And she made it possible to take us to Maastricht, which is on the bottom of the yellow part of the map, about 2 hours south of Amsterdam, where she had another store and did a mock, came up with a very risky plan to have a mock fashion show. My mother was already doing work under the table to earn some money with Gerda as a fashion person, etc. designing some things and etc. And my father, who was the artist, falsified the documents that served us well until crossing the Pyrenees, by the way. And we were stopped quite a few times. It passed the Gestapo Nazi inspections. On that first railroad ride of 2 hours, I was not allowed. That was the second experience after the paper handed to me by my mother, how I was going to handle not to recognize my parents during this 2.5 hours. So we sat in this railroad car, my mother on herself in some bench and my father on the back of us. I sat with Gerda, who personified to be my mother. And I remembered still now looking at my mother and whatever, and she looked down and out, and that caused quite an impression on me that I still remember of separation, unliked, or whatever word you want to use. The map in the middle is also reflected in the bottom one, which before the total occupation of France, France was naturally separated in the occupied zone, which was the top reddish part, and the bottom was a purplish color, was still free zone. That naturally then, eventually, the events went so far that we had to move on, and that's the map that you see next to France. The French flag is obvious. Some of you know what that means, and I'm not going to bother you with the French resistance worker and Free France. But there's a lot of history that needs to be told that hasn't yet been properly told for these heroes in France that worked to liberate their country. As we walked in the middle, which is between the red and the purple, there was this mythical place by the Cher River, and the idea was if we reached that was a pretty good thing, and then decide what was going to happen, what we were going to do next, and weigh things out. That's another big story. Somebody died. I'm not going to go into that. What?
You're 46 minutes into this.
There was an incident in we lived in a land, somebody was very generous and gave us a farmhouse, and I was persecuted and followed from school by German soldiers and hid in an outhouse from bottom to feet for half an hour. The next is the railroad car. And I was in that railroad car quite a few times. Not all of them had a guard tower. That was used by German military or the Wehrmacht. And they would kill anybody who was in and out of the train. And yes, there is clergy here tonight attending this. I don't call these, and I don't take well, people refer to these as cattle cars, because I don't believe that the people who were massed into these cars were cattle. They were human beings who were under big, strong hardships. Then there is a railroad station that I had to lie on the railroad track for half an hour one night before we eventually got ourselves on one of those freight cars, really not knowing where the train was going, either back to Germany or we were now in Perpignan, which is the map that you see between France and where my mother was in camp. the underground man was late. And to come back after that is the map there on the bottom. You see blue and red. The blue was supposed to be what we were told the train would be, which was a workers' train. But as Germans did, it changed route and went on the first red line, stopped in the middle of the track at some point, and a big joggling back and forth, and then resumed the trip south. In our car, there were Gestapo, naturally dressed that you could not confuse because they were always dressed with black hats and black long coats, etc., etc. And as usual, as I indicated before, my parents always traveled separate. So my mother was in a different place in the train, and my father and I were together. And suddenly the train stops in a gray, snowy, watery, muddy place. And I had my head on the pane of the window of the train. And suddenly I saw my father froze. And I didn't know what was going on. Well, what I was told later is he saw the name Gurs. And if you watch carefully, you can see Gurs. Gurs was a way station that the French started. And I'm not going to go into the history again. I'm already stopping me. So that is where we then saw many of the people dressed properly, being marched off, walking with polished shoes and black jackets and hats off to the way concentration camp of Gurs. It became quite a well-known place. We were not stopped. The Gestapo did pass my father and made some comments once or twice, but thanks God my father didn't respond. And actually he was terribly scared, as we were all, and the train continued to Perpignan. In the crossing of the border, there are a few things that you ought to know. I'm not going to tell you very much. I'm sorry, read my book.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what we call Operation Jump. We were in Perpignan for about 2.5 weeks, trying to decide, we, meaning my parents, what we were going to do. There were options. We could take the Mediterranean, go to North Africa, Greece, Palestine, cross the Pyrenees walking. My father was not sporty. I was too young. Snowy mountains, cold, and many partisans still opportunists taking advantage of the people fleeing, robbing and stealing what they could and then killing them or throwing them down the gorges. Or go to Andorra and stay there. Andorra is a small country in the middle of the Pyrenees. Well, nothing of this really seemed to click. And my mother, who knew 11 languages, was charming and outgoing and very prepared in talking to people, etc., etc., and knew French perfectly. Somehow, through met an attorney, and through the underground and Free France and Free Spain, what remained from the Republican Francoist people, got us on a plan that was the riskiest thing that had happened in a long time, which was to have 2 trains run parallelly for 1.5 miles through the tunnel at the same speed. One was the official workers' train taking people back from work to and across the border to Spain. And the other train was not scheduled when we were on, and I was supposed to, well, I was thrown over to the other train, and my father had to jump. We were dressed and disguised and trained by the underground, composed of the railroad unions of Turkey, French, France, and Spain. And we were given disguise dress and rucksacks with some food. We had to smooch ourselves with shoe polish. And my mother was going 2 days later, dressed as a young man. The breasts were taped, her hair had been cut, etc., etc. Which was a problem for my mother, was very in good times into fashion. But anyway, she was apprehended and put in similar prison than what you see there. But we lost contact with her for 3 months. We were already then in Barcelona. And the two stories are, I could keep you here for 5 weeks. Next. There you see on the top left how people dressed fleeing during the war. Dressed, shoes, hats, some had bells, some had in the front, they had these suitcases bulked up to the point where tips of ties and other belts were coming through the seams and closures of the suitcases. We never did that. We dressed as farmers. We went through the fields and never took main highways. If you look carefully ahead, you will see military equipment coming against those people walking and fleeing in the main artery there. Now, there was no way of these people hiding and telling who they were when you saw the Germans, because they would just kill you or put you in prison. I mean, that was, there was no way for them to hide. We didn't do that. And there's a picture of mine, and then we come to the bottom.
Well, let me quickly tell you about the picture. When our friend Rianne wrote the book about Merveda Plain, she made a lot of contacts with people and found somebody who lived right next door. Right next door to Peter was a family of 8 people living at one time, and they were all murdered except for the one girl who was a few years, was about 14 years old, 15. And Rianne found her living with a granddaughter in Scotland and contacted her and asked her if she knew Pieter Kohnstam, if she remembered Pieter Kohnstam. And she said, oh yes, that cute little blonde-haired boy. And his parents couldn't get into the United States because of his cleft lip. We had never heard that story. His parents never told him. But we're thinking if some 96-year-old can remember Peter with the blonde hair and the cleft lip, it must be true. So, because Peter's had a brother living in the United States as well as some cousins who could have very easily sponsored them. So we think this is true. Then this is the end. What's the difference?
Well, no, not yet. It's not the end. We are living, we are marching forward.
Yes.
So no end. However, the bottom 3 pictures are a depiction of what you see. And I've been asked by many people recently, both Latinos and not, people from the boat people from Vietnam I used to speak to. They were clients of mine at Estee Lauder, for example. We spent quite a lot of time talking what their experiences were and mine as a parallel. Why am I different from these people? What makes me so different to them? And you see on the bottom left, somebody picking up a baby. And I will tell you one story that I thought would be of interest. A few years ago, at a gala of Anne Frank, I had the honor of meeting Congressman John Lewis. And we eventually started a very nice acquaintance. There was a time where he said, you know, you don't have to call me Congressman Lewis, you call me Peter. I said, well, in honor, I have to call you a congressman. He said, you can call me my first name. He said, I had to cross that bridge during the Civil War. I was in prison being persecuted in America by white people. You fled as a Jewish person from the Germans. So he sort of knocked my arm and he said, you know, Peter, we have something in common. And I started thinking. And I said, you know, Congressman, you're right. Where are we different? Just because you're black and I'm white? And we left it at that. So I thought it was a very interesting conversation. Next.
That's it.
So, Rabbi Shull, I'm ready to answer questions if anybody has any.
This is time left.
I don't hear what you're saying.
And unmute.
Some of us need to unmute.
Yes,
Unmute Rabbi Shull.
unmute.
Unmute. All right, now I tried and it didn't work. Okay.
There
Yes,
we
you
go.
did. Yes, you did.
Now I am. Okay, good.
Now, now it worked.
Peter, you have an incredible memory and an incredible story to tell, and I know you do that on a regular basis. Unfortunately, we won't have time for questions and answers now due to the fact that we have a little bit more of a ceremony to get through. But
I just want to, Rabbi, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to say one thing. The story doesn't end there.
yeah,
The story is what happened in Barcelona. My mother worked for the underground Free France. We had a friend who was in the army, who was eventually sent to Operation Torch in North Africa, for those of you who are interested in history. So there is something there that I know from my own experience. And then we went to Argentina. And that became another story that I could keep you here for 2 weeks.
No.
well, folks, come when we're back open at the JCV. Peter's always there with a wonderful hand of welcome, and I'm sure we're glad to share more of his story. Buy his book as well, and I get no credit for that sales of that book. It's an excellent description of.
Oh, there you go.
I'm trying to show it to everyone.
Hey, Rabbi
Yeah.
Sniderman, you're a good man.
Yeah, I read the book and appreciated every page. Yes.
Okay, thank you again, Peter, and thank you, Susan, very much.
I understand we have a video now.
Yes.
Yes.
This is a video that I'd like to thank Betty Zaret and two women who are survivors of the Holocaust speaking in front of wonderful art about embracing our differences in Sarasota.
Okay. And I believe we're in the process of trying to connect all of that. I see a little nod. Yes.
You can't hear the audio. You have to, before you share, you have to click sound.
Was working before and now it's giving me trouble. Can everyone see the video?
Yes.
Okay, go back.
My name is Jeanette Hirsch. I am a Holocaust survivor from France. I was between the ages of 12 and 16.
My name is Felicia Liban. I'm 87 years old, and I was a hidden child during the Holocaust of World War II.
I was hidden by principals in the schools, in the boarding schools. They knew I was Jewish. Nobody else did.
I was hidden with a Polish Christian family from 1942 to 1945. And they kept me until my mother came back for me.
My mother lost all her brothers and sisters, but I survived by the grace of God. I'm still here and I'm 93.
I was looking at this billboard that's behind me, and I thought it was very reminiscent of what we all wish we could do to be kinder and better towards the next human being.
I chose this poster because of the mask. It is something that is part of our time.
That's what the Holocaust was really about, that there was such hate and terrible demise of the Jewish people.
We have to learn to accept, respect, love each other, no matter whom we are, what race, what religion. We have to live together.
Remember the past and all we lost, and have hope for the future.
I want to thank Peter and Susan and want to share with you a recommendation that you all read this book. You may not be able to see it very well given our technology, but the story is told there in far more detail than what we heard tonight. And perhaps I'm just throwing out the idea we could have another program in the future. We could all come down to Venice and hear you talk a little bit more. Whatever meaningful statements we can make, sometimes they fall flat, sometimes they sound inane, sometimes it's the same thing we've heard over and over again. I cannot find the right words I wrote the other day to express what I really feel, and anything that comes out dissatisfies me. But the fact remains, there are those who survived, and we are still here, and there is a message that needs to be taught. May we all be given the strength to teach that message. Let me now call upon Rabbi Shull, who will give some reflections on the rise of anti-Semitism today.
Ma nishtana. We asked that question the Seder night, and we ask it tonight. How is this Yom HaShoah different? It's different because we are different, for we witnessed the terrible events of January 6, 2021. On that day, we saw an angry mob storm the Capitol, the seat of our government. We saw how fragile democracy is. We came to realize that angry words and fear-mongering can indeed topple our government. And we saw amidst the crowd expressions of hate, like the man wearing a shirt with Camp Auschwitz emblazoned across the front. Yes, it is true, and we are grateful that politicians on both sides denounced the violence that day. But that day made us question, is this still the America that gave the Jewish people a safe haven? January 6, 2021, the Capitol insurrection, Hanukkah, 2019, a knife-wielding man attacks Jews celebrating Hanukkah at the home of a rabbi. October 27, 2018, a gun-wielding man murders 11 Jews on Shabbat in the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. These, and sadly so many other dates in recent history on which Jews have been attacked, both in the United States and around the world, weigh upon us on this Yom HaShoah. Yom HaShoah is about remembrance, but it is also about vigilance. Of course, we Jews are much more sensitive to the warning signs of a darker future. We see Asian Americans afraid. We see African Americans afraid. We see supporters of Israel afraid. Yes, this Yom HaShoah is different, for it serves as a stark reminder that this beloved country, filled with so many kind and generous people, this beloved country too has a dark underbelly. This Yom HaShoah is different. It serves as a reminder that nothing is guaranteed, that the vision of the prophet Amos, Vayigal kamayim mishpat utzdaka kenachal etan. Let justice well up like water and righteousness like an unfailing stream. This vision of Amos is a charge, not only for the past, but for every generation now and in the days to come. Okay, I'm just checking here.
Yes, we need to remind ourselves constantly to unmute. It's a sign of the times. We're going to call on Cantor Vitkus, who will lead us in El Malei Rachamim. Those of you who are able, please rise.
Fully compassionate God on high, to our 6 million brothers and sisters murdered because they were Jews. Grant clear and certain rest with you in the lofty heights of the sacred and pure, whose brightness shines like the very glow of heaven. Source of mercy, forever enfold them in the embrace of your wings, secure their souls in eternity. Adonai, they are yours. They will rest in peace. Malei Rachamim, Shochen Bamromim, Hamitzei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei Hashchina, B'ma'alot Kedoshim Utahorim, Kezohar Harakia Mazhirim. Et nishmo 6 million achinu v'achyoteinu shenehergu al kiddush Hashem. Ba'al harachamim yastirem b'seter kenafav le'olamim. ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבם. אמן.
We now call on Rabbi Shull for a concluding prayer.
We end tonight with silence. Silence of death, silence after destruction. There are times when songs falter, when darkness fills life, when martyrdom becomes a constellation of faith against the unrelieved black of space about us. There are no words to reach beyond the edge of night, no messenger to tell the full tale. there is only silence. The silence of Job, the silence of the 6 million, the silence of memory. Let us remember them as we link our silences. We thank everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you again, Peter and Susan. Thank you, Rabbi Sniderman. And we wish everyone strength and hope. Erev Tov.
Erev Tov. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.